Hey there everybody, this is Jeff Murrin. I'm going to walk you through, or walk with you through, I should say, another classic novel. This time it's a departure from my normal works. I've read, world literature, ancient pieces like the Iliad, the Odyssey, Beowulf, things like that. So if you are interested in those, or if you need help with those, if you're taking a class and those are kind of leaving you in a quandary, you can look through, find my page on YouTube and maybe dig those up. Hamlet's out there too. And there's also some grammar. If you are struggling with that, maybe I can, some of the videos out there will help you with grammar. This time, I'm going to look at an American novel, namely The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. I'm going to be looking at the Barnes & Noble Classics edition. Not necessarily because I think that is the best edition or that I think you should be using that edition too. And if you've found this because you have been assigned this and you are struggling with the reading, and your teacher or whatever, or professor has insisted that you read a different edition, that's fine. I think they all contain the exact same text. It's just that maybe my page numbers will be a little bit different, but I will try to make sure that you don't get lost as I dive into and pick this thing apart. So one of the a few things I want to mention before we get started with this particular book, because I find it very interesting how Nathaniel Hawthorne weaves his symbolism throughout this particular work. And I think it's interesting because what we can rely upon and what we can know will be absolutely 100% consistent is change throughout this particular novel. Relationships change throughout. People grow within the community and become accepted by the community in a certain way that maybe they hadn't been accepted before. And certain symbols take on different meaning as the novel progresses. All right, we see the actual Scarlet Letter, first implying one thing, but then coming to sort of represent a different. It's looked at a different way by its wearer and by other people as the novel works its way through, and that happens with a lot of things. And so I will want you to pay attention to this. I'm not going to give a lot of background on Massachusetts colony or anything like that. There's plenty of information for you to do that. If you're in one of my classes, I will probably have sat you down and walked you through those types of things. But what these videos are going to do is going to look at specifically the text itself. What is in the text? How does the text work? The commentary, what I feel important. And hopefully through this, you will have a fuller picture of what's going on. You might have an easier time of understanding what's going on. And it can just be a way to enrich your reading and help you through this. All right, so without further ado, let's go ahead and let's jump right in. And I'm going to start with The Prison Door, which on my book begins on page 41. All right, now this is interesting, and this is another characteristic, I think, of this particular book, is this book is so ripe with contrasts. We see something and it seems absolutely clear what Nathaniel Hawthorne is trying to get us to see, or how he's getting us to understand the circumstance, Massachusetts, the people in Massachusetts, but there's one thing that seems a little bit off. There's one thing that seems to be sort of, I don't know, a glimmer in the darkness, a little bit of light, a little bit of color, a little bit of something, so that the darkness and the despair doesn't overwhelm the reader and doesn't even probably overwhelm the people in Massachusetts. And I'll point that out right here. This is a very short chapter, all right, but there's a lot in it. One thing I want to point out is very early on, like the first words, it says, a throng of bearded men in sad colored garments and gray steeple crown hats. I think that's interesting that they are steeple crown hats, because what we are going to get ourselves fully immersed in is just the religiosity of the Massachusetts colony here. All right. And the reason they came over was for religious freedom. Their religious freedom, mind you. Everybody else's religious freedom be damned. Okay. You'll see how terrible he makes mentions of how terrible Quakers, for example, were viewed, and how they were cast out or scourged or whatever. And so religion is the way that the lens through which they seem to view everything. All right. So it's interesting that they have steeple crowned hat. The steeple, I live in Texas, and so, there's a church on every corner, and usually one in the middle of the block as well. We're no strangers to what a steeple is or what that means. It's that spire that reaches up from a church well up into the sky as if it's pointing its way to God or something like that. Okay. So these people are wearing hats that he refers to as steeple crowned hats. All right. And he mentions, there is this door. The door is heavily timbered with oak and studded with iron spikes. Okay, so we're talking about something that's very strong, something that, iron spikes, something that seems very, stay away from this place. This place is something that is, not for the faint of heart. All right. Then we get into, he says, the founder of the new colony, whatever utopia, of human virtue and happiness they might originally project, have invariably recognized it among their earliest practical necessities to allot a portion of the virgin soil, a cemetery, and another portion as the site of a prison. So that's one thing. It's like we've come over here to start our own utopia, our own religious utopia, where we can do what we want. But one of the first things that he notes that the people set up was a cemetery and a prison. All right. The contrast of the utopia that we're hopeful for, but the reality, what we actually know is going to happen, is we're going to need a place to bury our dead and lock up those who do not comply with what, with our idea of what utopia is. All right, so about midway through that second paragraph, I'm going to read quite a bit to you, and I'm going to stop as I feel it's, it's important. But it says, certain it is, all right, certain it is that some 15 or 20 years after the settlement of the town, the wooden jail was already marked with weather stains and other indications of age, which gave a yet darker aspect to the beetle brown and gloomy front. The rust on the ponderous ironwork and the oaken door looked more antique than anything else in the New World. All right, so this thing has, it's like this is the New World, but this thing is dark. It's, beetle brown. It's got these iron rusty things and spikes, and so this is just something that is a contrast to what they had hoped to establish, but it was something they knew was a necessity for them. All right. It goes on, let's see, it says, the rust on the ponderous ironwork was of its oaken door looked more antique. I just read that. Okay. So it says, like all that pertains to crime, all right, get this, it seemed never to have known a youthful era. All right, it's well used. Before this ugly edifice, and between it and the wheel track of the street, was a grass plot, much overgrown with burdock, pigweed, apple pern, and such unsightly vegetation, which evidently found something congenial in the soil that had so early borne the black flower of civilized society, a prison. All right, so we're talking weeds, we're talking overgrown, we're talking this prison, we're talking rust, we're talking just terrible things. However, let's see this. But on one side of the portal, and rooted almost at the threshold, was a wild rose bush, covered in this month of June with its delicate gems, which might be imagined to offer their fragrance and fragile beauty to the prisoner as he went in, and to the condemned criminal as he came forth to his doom, in token of that deep heart of nature could pity and be kind to him. All right. So even amidst all this darkness, even amidst all this, rust and iron and prison and overgrown with weeds, there is this one natural beauty that seems to still push forth. All right. It's natural. It's not something that's forced to be there. It's something that has grown on its own accord in this circumstance. All right. As if that one thing has the strength to shine through. And notice with that thing that is natural and with that thing is beauty, all of a sudden we see pity and kind. Those words. We haven't really seen those words just yet now, have we? All right. But this, it's there, right? There is beauty there. There is kindness there. There is pity there, all right? Although all these other images may seem to crowd it out, all right? On the next page, also, we see the name Anne Hutchinson. I want to give a little bit of background as to who Anne Hutchinson is, all right? She was somebody who was, I guess, what we would maybe call her an early feminist. She was somebody who was like, no, look, I don't abide by this patriarchal, male-driven religious situation that we have going on here. All right, I feel that I am able to preach, and she did. She bucked the system. She would hold meetings in her home to lead people in religious practices. All right, which was an absolute no-no. All right, she was not one who could be ordained as a female. She was banished from Massachusetts as a result of that. Okay, but continued to do her own thing, kind of thumbing her nose at that religious establishment, whatever the consequences may be. All right, so of course, you can read that on your own, but these are some things that I wanted to point out in this prison door chapter. So here in this next second chapter, it's titled The Marketplace. We see like where all of the happenings go on as people gather, and we are going to be introduced here to our protagonist. All right, and it is the marketplace, but it is also the prison that we just looked at is part of this is part of the whole of this marketplace. All right. One thing I want to point out as we begin to look at this particular chapter is, let's see. I mentioned earlier about religious freedom and sort of the ironies of like, hey, we are here because we believe in religious freedom. We want religious freedom. We want to practice our religion, with all kinds of liberty or whatnot. However, we don't extend that to everything else. And here's a good point. This is about halfway down that first page, all right, where it begins. It says, it might be, all right, that an antinomian, okay, which it says, mine has a little note here. It says, antinomians believe that God's law existed in faith rather than the laws of the church or civil society. So they were like, we believe in something other than what the normal puritanical, ideals of Massachusetts are, but, aren't we here for religious freedom, all right? So we don't believe in your customs. We don't believe in this. We believe in, God just simply through faith. Well, no, that's not okay in this religious free society. A Quaker, it says, or other heterodox religionist was to be scourged out of the town. Or an idle and vagrant Indian, it says, whom the white man's firewater had made riotous about the streets, was to be driven with stripes, that means like, beaten, was driven with stripes into the shadow of the forest. It might be, too, that a witch, like old Mistress Hibbins, the bitter-tempered widow of the magistrate, was to die upon the gallows. All right. So while we are here under the guise of creating a religious, free utopian society, we already have a cemetery, we already have a prison, we already have, people being scourged out of town, whipping Indians, Native Americans into the forest away because they don't fit. They get in out, their exercise of their freedom. Does this sound familiar? Their exercising of their freedom gets in the way of me exercising my freedom. And my freedom is what matters, because my freedom is the right freedom. Their freedom is not the right freedom. All right. So it's interesting on the next page, the paragraph that begins, it was a coincidence, to be noted on the summer morning when our story begins its course, that the women seem to be very interested. The women, of whom there were several in the crowd, appeared to take particular interest in whatever penal infliction might be expressed to ensue. All right, so he notes that the women seem a little bit curious as to what's taking place here. All right, now listen to the way he describes the women of this particular area. I said, at the beginning it says, morally, as well as materially, there was a coarser fiber in those wives and maidens of old English birth and breeding than in their descendants, separated from them by a series of 6 or 7 generations. For throughout the chain of ancestry, every successive mother had transmitted to her child a fainter bloom, a more delicate and briefer beauty, and slighter physical frame, if not a character of less force and solidity than her own. The women who were now standing about the prison door stood with less than half a century of the period when the manlike Elizabeth had been the not altogether unsuitable representative of the sex. They were her countrywomen, and the beef and ale of their native land, with a moral diet not a whit more refined, entered largely into their composition. So he's not describing them as, the most, wonderful. Okay, their beauty is briefer. They have a lesser bloom in them than before. So pass down, pass down, pass down. This has been harder and harder and harder on these women. But watch whenever we see our protagonist, how she is described. And we see her. She is named in the next paragraph. Her name is Hester Prynne. All right, Hester Prynne. And she is the one who is going to be released from the prison. She's the one who is in trouble. She's the female that all the other females are wanting to see, okay, how is this going to play out with her? All right. We see here one paragraph says that people say, said another, that the Reverend Master Dimsdale, her godly pastor, takes it very grievously to heart that such a scandal should have come upon his congregation. All right, so this Hester Prynne is a parishioner of Reverend Master Dimsdale. And it's Mr. Dimsdale is looking at what has become of Hester Prynne, and he's expressed that he is upset that everything that has gone on with Hester Prynne has been brought into his particular congregation. All right, so they will see, yes, they do quite have a history, Dimsdale and Hester Prynne. All right. Let's see. As we go on, I want you to see what sort of how the women. It mentions that the women actually want Hester Prynne to be branded. Okay, and they're sort of upset that there is a way that she might be able to be able to cover up the punishment that she is going to be given. All right. But look at this. There's a paragraph that begins, what do we talk of marks and brands were on the bodice of her gown or the flesh of her forehead? Whether she has to wear I sinned this way, or even it was branded on the middle of her forehead. Cried another female, the ugliest as well as the most pitiless of these self-constituted judges. This woman has brought shame upon us all and ought to die. This is a very harsh bunch, but do you remember that rose bush that we just looked at? The difference of the rose bush, all right? It was offering, something kind, something, some pity to whoever was in that. But the people, not so much, all right? We see here a paragraph beginning, the door of the jail being flung open from within. There appeared in the first place like a black shadow emerging into the sunshine, the grim and grisly presence of the town beadle with a sword by his side and a staff of office in his hand. Right? This is a person who is, has a religious office, so to speak. All right. And this is a theocratic society, right? There was no separation of church and state here, all right, in this free society. This is a person who can enforce laws of the church and of the laws that come through, the religiousness of the society, all right. And it says, this personage prefigured and represented in his aspect the whole dismal severity of the Puritanic code of law. Whew. All right. Now, this is interesting. As we see Hester Prynne leave the prison, it says, the shoulder of this young woman, whom he thus drew forward until on the threshold of the prison door, she repelled him by an action marked with a natural dignity and force of character, and stepped into the open air as if by her own or free will. The irony here that they want her dead. She needs to be branded. She's going to have to wear something to just indicate I am a sinner and I did this, okay? She's been imprisoned and she's walking out as if it's of her own free will. The irony is thick with this, okay? But see this, she bore in her arms a child. This is important. A baby of some 3 months old who winked and turned aside its little face from the too vivid light of day. It's as if this child has never really seen the light of day. This child, the mother, have been in this dark, dreary prison for so long. All right. Let's see here. But we see this. This is very important. This is the Scarlet Letter, ladies and gentlemen. All right. About the end of so the paragraph begins. When the young woman. All right. But this is the last few sentences of that particular paragraph. It says, on the breast of her gown, in fine red cloth, surrounded with an elaborate embroidery and fantastic flourishes of gold thread, appeared the letter A. It was so artistically done, and with such fertility and gorgeous luxuriance of fancy, that it had all the effect of a last and fitting decoration to the apparel which she wore, and which was of a splendor in accordance with the taste of the age, but greatly beyond what was allowed by the sumptuary relegations of the colony. All right, so there is this thing she has to wear. It's the red letter A, okay? She has a child. She's not married, we will learn, all right? She has committed adultery, all right? And there is not only the child that she's going to have to look after for the rest of her life as a constant reminder to her and everybody else that she has committed adultery, but sort of an insult to injury or whatever, okay? What you'll see is that she has to wear this big A, but she is an esteemed, accomplished seamstress. So she has taken this thing and made it beautiful, right? Again, something that is dark, something that is meant to be a, ugly thing, she has made it gorgeous. And she has done so even though it's not appropriate or it's against the regulations for her to do so, all right? So we can see that this Hester Prynne might seem to buck the system, from time to time, all right? Now, you'll see there in the next paragraph, towards the end of that next paragraph, it says, the Scarlet Letter, so fantastically embroidered and illuminated upon her bosom, it had the effect of a spell, taking her out of the ordinary relations with humanity and enclosing her in a sphere by herself. Well, isn't that kind of what prison does? It removes you from society. It puts you somewhere else and separates you from everybody else. All right. So she's being released. of her own free will with this thing that's ugly, that she's made beautiful, that is still going to separate her and keep her from everybody else. All right? It's interesting how this seems to navigate and weave through, these ideas. All right? And so these women, they see this beautiful thing and they are not happy with it. You can see in the next, not the next paragraph, but there's a paragraph that says, "It were well," muttered one of the iron-visaged of the old dames, "if we stripped Madam Hester's rich gown off her dainty shoulders, and as for the red letter which she has stitched so curiously, I'll bestow a rag of mine own rheumatic flannel to make a fitter one." All right? She can have one of my old rags and make an A out of that and stitch that. That's more appropriate than this work of art that she has created for herself. All right? So now what we see is her punishment is to stand on the scaffold for a number of hours, to be on public display as a sinner with this A, indicating her adultery, which obviously her child is, a symbol of that, of course, but to be gawked at, ridiculed, or whatever. Okay, this is part of her sentence, all right? But check this out. It says, the paragraph begins, in fact, the scaffold, but I'm going to go more than halfway through that long paragraph there. It says, "In Hester Prynne's instance, however, as not unfrequently in other cases, her sentence bore that she should stand a certain time upon the platform, but without undergoing that gripe about the neck and confinement of the head, the proneness of which was the most devilish characteristic of this ugly engine." All right, so they're not going to hang her. Okay, they're not going to put the noose around her neck and hang her, but she's going to have to stand there. And she's going to have to just be on display for quite some time. She's going to be pilloried, as it were. But listen to this. Listen to this description of her compared to the description of the women we heard earlier. All right? It said, had there been a papist, that would be a Catholic, a papist, the Pope. Okay, had there been a papist among the crowd of Puritans, he might have seen in this beautiful woman, so picturesque in her attire and mien, that with the infant at her bosom, an object to remind him of the image of the divine maternity, which so many illustrious painters have vied with one another to represent. Something which should remind him indeed, but only by contrast, of that sacred image of sinless motherhood, whose infant was to redeem the world. All right? She looks as, beautiful as the Virgin Mary with her son, Jesus Christ, the Savior. However, hers is because of sin, not because of immaculate conception. So again, the contrast, the beauty. But let's not get too carried away with the beauty, because the beauty is there for a reason, and the reason is dark, ugly sin. All right? Let's see. Lastly, as she's there, she's looking down, she's seeing her past, and she's seeing how she got here. And there's one particular section I want to read. Okay, this is the paragraph, the very long, next to the last paragraph that begins, "Be that as it might, the scaffold of the pillory was a point of view." Okay, that revealed to Hester Prynne the entire track along which she had been freeing since her happy infancy. Okay, so she's kind of, her life is flashing before her eyes. But look, about midway through that, okay, it says, "There she beheld another countenance of a man well stricken in years, a pale, thin, scholar-like visage, with eyes dim and bleared by the lamplight that had served them to pore over many ponderous books. Yet those same bleared optics had strange penetrating power when it was their owner's purpose to read the human soul." All right. This figure of the study and the cloister, as Hester Prynne's womanly fancy failed not to recall, was slightly deformed, with the left shoulder a trifle higher than the right. Okay, so there is this person, this very learned individual, who is not only book smart, but can penetrate through the human soul to understand and read another human being. All right, I want you to remember that and think about that particular individual. All right, so that's where I'm going to leave this chapter, and let's move on to the next. All right, we are going to take a look at and get into the recognition, which is chapter 3. All right, and so what we see is, we've kind of been describing Hester Prynne and what's going on and the Scarlet Letter and all this kind of stuff, but now we are going to see some of the people, and in particular individual who kind of bears a very similar description, or has this, the Hawthorne gives us a very similar description as that person we just read about. Okay, so it says here, where do I want to start? It says, on the outskirts of the crowd, this is in the very first paragraph, on the outskirts of the crowd, a figure which irresistibly took possession of her thoughts. An Indian in his native garb was standing there, but the red man, okay, we don't use these terms anymore, were not so infrequent visitors in the English settlements that one of them would have attracted any notice from Hester Prynne. Okay, of course, that this was their land, this was their country. Okay, so them hanging around, seeing what's going on with these white folks is not out of the ordinary. All right. It says, much less would he have been excluded by all other objects and ideas from her mind. By the Indian's side, and evidently sustaining a companionship with him, stood a white man, clad in strange disarray of civilized and savage costume. So this person is dressed as if he has been spending a lot of time not with the other white people with their steepled hats and things like that, okay, but he's sort of dressed more as though he has been with the Native Americans and things like that, okay, and kind of adopted some of their clothing. All right. It says he was small in stature with a furrowed visage, yet as yet could hardly be termed aged. There was a remarkable intelligence, okay, a remarkable intelligence in his features, as of a person who had so cultivated his mental part that it could not fail to mold the physical to itself and become manifest by unmistakable tokens. All right. So yes, we're seeing that this is that same person who was just described. All right. Although by a seemingly careless arrangement of his heterogeneous garb, he had endeavored to conceal or abate the peculiarity, it was sufficiently evident to Hester Prynne that one of this man's shoulders rose higher than the other. Yes, this is obvious, the same particular person. Now, I want you to see something. I think this is very interesting. In the next paragraph, it says, a writhing horror twisted itself across his features. Writhing. What writhes? Well, you'll see. Like a snake. Snake. We're in a religious place, and this person is writhing and having something snake-like associated with him. I wonder how we're supposed to view this person. All right. And making one little pause with all his wreathed intervolutions in open sight, his face darkened with some powerful emotion, which nevertheless he so instantaneously is controlled by an effort of his will, that save at a single moment its expression might have passed for calmness. After a brief space, the convulsion grew almost imperceptible and finally subsided into the depths of his nature. Almost like he took that snake-like writhing and darkness and just sort of brought it into his own nature so that it didn't show on the face. Okay. When he found the eyes of Hester Prynne fastened on his own and saw that she appeared to recognize him, he slowly and calmly raised his finger, made a gesture with it in the air, and laid it on his lips. Like, shh, don't you tell anybody that I'm here. Or don't you say a word. Okay? I know you. All right? All right. He asks, I pray you, good sir, who is this woman, and wherefore is she set up to the public shame? All right? As if he doesn't know. He's trying to, be a calm and, blend in with everybody else. Like, who is this? And the person says, you must needs be a stranger in this region, friend. Okay? It says, else you would surely have heard of Mistress Hester Prynne and her evil doing. She hath raised great scandal, I promise you, in godly Master Dimsdale's church. All right. he goes on. It's funny because he says, Hester Prynne, have I named her rightly? He says that in the next paragraph. Like, did I say her name correctly? Like, come on, dude. Laying it on pretty thick there, if you ask me. All right, so something I want to show you is a bit of that, her being pilloried, her standing on that platform for a while. It's on page 54. This is the paragraph that begins, "It behooves him well." All right, and this is the last lines here. This person is describing to this stranger who, it says, "But in there, the people who, the magistrates who put the, who determine what, punishment is, says, in their great mercy," it says, "and tenderness of heart, they have doomed Mistress Prynne to stand only a space of 3 hours on the platform of the pillory, and then and thereafter, for the remainder of her natural life, to wear a mark of shame upon her bosom." All right, so that's it. They're not going to kill her. They're not going to brand her. She has to stand there for 3 hours, kind of get ridiculed, be, gawked at or whatever. And then after that, she's got to wear an A. All right, that's merciful, he says. All right, this person does say, though, the stranger mentions, it says, "A wise sentence," remarked the stranger, gravely bowing his head. "Thus she will be a living sermon against sin, until the ignominious letter be engraved upon her tombstone. It irks me, nevertheless, that the partner of her iniquity, the person she slept with, should not at least stand on the scaffold by her side." He says this, "But he will be known, he will be known, he will be known." 3 times. Sounds very ominous, doesn't it? All right. So, it's interesting, too, that in the, a couple paragraphs later, the child, Hester's child, is referred to as the sin-born infant. All right. Now, I want you to see this. This is the paragraph that begins, "It has already been noticed." All right, so watch this. The way this is set up, I think this is very interesting. "It has already been noticed that directly over the platform on which Hester Prynne stood was a kind of balcony or open gallery appended to the meeting house. It was the place whence proclamations were wont to be made amidst the assemblage of the magistracy, with all the ceremonial that attended such public observances in those days. Here, to witness the scene which we are describing, sat Governor Bellingham himself with 4 sergeants about his chair, bearing halberds as a guard of honor. He wore a dark feather in his hat, a border of embroidery on his cloak, and black velvet tunic beneath, a gentleman advanced in years and with hard experience written in his wrinkles." Okay, so where she is on this pillory, above are these people who cast judgment, is as if they are godlike. They are up here above, casting judgment down on Hester Prynne. Okay, they have sort of set themselves up on a higher plane, a higher tier than she, as she is just accepting. Okay, as if they are, God, and she is, a human accepting whatever fate they give to her. Okay, I found that to be very interesting. All right, we see someone named John Wilson. Okay, where it says John Wilson, the eldest clergyman of Boston, a great scholar like most of his contemporaries in the profession, and withal a man of kind and genial spirit. It says the last attribute, his kind, genial spirit, however, had been less carefully developed than his intellectual gifts. So he was smarter than he was actually kind, it says. All right. But listen to this. He speaks to Hester Prynne. It says, "Hester Prynne," said the clergyman, "I have striven with my young brother here, under whose preaching of the word you have been privileged to sit." All right. So he's referring to the Reverend Master Dimsdale. All right. Here, Mr. Wilson laid his hand on the shoulder of a pale young man beside him. "I have sought, I say, to persuade this godly youth that he should deal with you here in the face of heaven, and before these wise and upright rulers, and in hearing of all the people, touching the vileness and blackness of your sin. knowing your natural temper better than I, he could the better judge what. I'm having a hard time. He could the better judge what arguments to use, whether of tenderness or terror, such as might prevail over your hardness and obstinacy, insomuch that you should no longer hide the name of him who tempted you to this grievous fall. But he opposes to me, with a young man's over softness, albeit wise beyond his years, that it were that it were wronging the very nature of woman to force her to lay open her heart's secret in such broad daylight, and in presence of so great a multitude. Truly, as I sought to convince him, the shame lay in the commission of the sin, and not in the showing of it forth. What say you to it? Once again, Brother Dimmesdale, must it be thou or I that shall deal with this poor sinner's soul? All right, so here's the deal. He's claiming that Mr. Dimmesdale, or Master Dimmesdale, Reverend Dimmesdale, is very kind. And Reverend Dimmesdale has said, this here, all right, he believes that a woman should be able to keep the secret. Okay, she can take it with her, and she's suffering the consequences, and it is not actually for her to, tell if she doesn't want to tell, and definitely not here to sell somebody out on the pillory as she's being, gawked at and ostracized. But what do you say? All right. It says, there was a murmur among the dignified and reverent occupants of the balcony, and Governor Bellingham gave expression to his purport, speaking in an authoritative voice, although tempered with respect towards the youthful clergyman whom he addressed. Good Master Dimmesdale, said he, the responsibility of this woman's soul lies greatly with you. Okay? You're her reverend, you're her preacher, you're her minister. All right? It behooves you, therefore, to exhort her to repentance and to confession as a proof of consequence thereof. Okay, so she confesses to her sins. That means she's breaking from her sins. Okay, remember that. Okay, if you ever read the Crucible, okay, if you confess, that is proof that you are breaking from it. And if you sell out the other person, then you are no longer wanting to stay tied to that. That's another thing. Okay, that seems to be a theme in this particular thing. If you sell out the other person, then you're not involved in it anymore. All right. So it says, Mr. Dimmesdale, a young clergyman who had come from one of the great English universities, bringing all the learning of the age into the wild forest land, his eloquence and religious fervor had already given the earnest of high eminence in his profession. He was a person of very striking aspect. All right, he looked good. With white, lofty, and impending brow, large, brown, melancholy eyes, and a mouth which, unless when he forcibly compressed it, was apt to be tremulous, expressing both nervous sensibility and a vast power of self-restraint. Notwithstanding his high native gifts and scholarlike attainments, there was an air about this young minister, an apprehensive, a startled, half-frightened look, as if a being who felt himself quite astray and a loss of the pathway of human existence could only be at ease in some seclusion of his own. Therefore, so far as his duties would permit, he trode in the shadowy bypaths, and thus kept himself simple and childlike. Coming forth with occasion was, and with freshness and fragrance and dewy purity thought, which, as many people said, affected them like the speech of an angel. All right. This guy's being described, I would say, rather differently, would you not, than most other people? Hester seems to be described very differently than most other women. Reverend Dimmesdale seems to be described more, most differently than other of the men here. Wonder why that is. All right. Then it says, such was the young man whom the Reverend Mr. Wilson and the governor had introduced so openly to the public notice. Okay. It says down there at the bottom of this particular page, I charge thee speak about the name of thy fellow sinner and fellow sufferer. All right, this is Dimmesdale. This is Dimmesdale speaking to Hester Prynne. I charge thee, Hester, Okay. Speak out the name of thy fellow sinner and fellow sufferer. Be not silent from any mistaken pity and tenderness for him. For believe me, Hester, though he were to step down from a high place, so if this is somebody of a high rank, all right, and stand there beside thee on thy pedestal of shame, yet better were it so than hide a guilty heart through life. It would be better for this person to lower himself, to stand there with you, than to remain in his high position, but have to hide this sin. Okay? What can thy silence do for him, except it tempt him, yea, compel him as it were, and add hypocrisy to his sin? Interesting. All right? Yet, we see the paragraph towards the end says, she will not speak. She's not going to sell out who was the person who she slept with, who she committed this adultery with. That's going to go with her. Okay? So she will not speak, muttered Mr. Dimmesdale, who, leaning over the balcony with his hand upon his heart and waited the result of his appeal, he now drew back with a long respiration. Wondrous strength and generosity of a woman's heart. She will not speak. So he considers her keeping silent to be wondrous strength and considers it generosity. Interesting. All right. We're going to leave it there. All right. So those are the 3 chapters I wanted to get through in this particular video. I know it took some time to do it, but I hope you found it useful. All right. So stay tuned. There will be another video coming straight on the heels of this one with another 3 chapters from the Scarlet Letter. All right. So I'm going to end this one as I always do. Ladies and gentlemen, please, happy reading.